Welcome to the Statewide Transportation Improvement Fund Oregon Administrative Rules webinar. This is Karen Criswell with ODOT. I'm the project manager for starting up this fabulous new transit fund. And here in the room with me, who's going to be providing some support and helping with the question feature, is Seth Baker. So let's go ahead and get started. Not working. Okay, so the topics that we're going to be covering today, we'll start with a general overview of the rules and how the rules are organized. And then we will talk through the three major sections of the STIF rules. There's the general section, which applies to all three funding programs. And then there are more specific rules that apply to the formula fund. And then the two discretionary funds are also covered in a single set of rules.
Sounds like they're having trouble hearing you. I'm not sure if you can...
I don't know how that's possible, Teresa. Okay, is that better now? I'm going to keep going and assume that it is, but if it isn't, let me know. So today during the webinar, in terms of how to ask questions, you could use the chat feature to ask questions during the presentations. If you're attending a group workshop with the regional transit coordinators, thank you very much for coming to those meetings. You can write your questions down and pass them to the regional transit coordinator, and that RTC will submit the chat function or submit the question via the chat function. We'll do our best to answer those questions during the webinar, but any unanswered questions will be recorded and addressed within the 2 weeks. I'm just going to make sure, Seth, that you hit record already.
Did.
Okay. So that's the other thing, is that we're recording the webinar and we'll be posting it on the STIF website within the next day or so after the webinar. Within a couple of weeks of the webinar, we'll be updating the STIF FAQ that's on our website with any unanswered questions. Okay, so let's keep rolling. The STIF Rules Advisory Committee worked with ODOT staff over a period of 6 months to develop recommended formula fund and discretionary rules. The OARs were approved by the Oregon Transportation Commission on June 22nd and went into effect on July 1st, 2018. For those who aren't already familiar, OIRs are organized and listed by chapter, division, and section, where Chapter 732 pertains to STIF. The divisions are 040 is for general, 042 is formula, 044 is for discretionary. And then the sections within the divisions are 4 digits starting with zeros and increasing by increments of 5. And so what I've done is, for each of these major areas or key elements, is I've included the OIR citation so you know exactly where to look for more information. So starting with the general rules, this slide is reflecting a table of content for the general rules. We won't be going through each of these in detail. We will be hitting on probably the key topics, the things that are most important and most immediate for us in terms of the upcoming formula fund solicitation. So for the general rules that we'll be focusing on today: purpose and use of STIF funds, fund distributions, fund eligibility, advisory committees and the composition of advisory committees, and a bit about reporting requirements, because that certainly affects how you will submit your STIF formula fund applications. So starting with purpose and use of STIF in general. Part of this is a combination of what's in statute and what's in a rule. STIF can be used to finance investments and improvements in public transportation, except for light rail capital. Its primarily for improvements and expansions in the first funding cycle. There is language in the rules, however, about maintaining service, using the funds to maintain an existing service, because it is assumed that service will be expanded or new service added during the first cycle and then maintained in future funding cycles. STIF plans that propose to use STIF formula funds to supplant local funds may result in Oregon Transportation Commission rejection of the STIF plan. Formula fund applicants will be asked to specify whether a project is an expansion or improvement project or a project that would maintain an existing service. If you are proposing a project in this first cycle that would maintain an existing service, you'll be asked to provide the rationale for that proposal. Other purposes or uses: planning and operation, administration of STIF-funded public transportation, including but not limited to creating new systems and services with origins, destinations, or stops in Oregon, maintaining systems and services, developing local transit plans or STIF plans, and it could also be used as local match for state and federal public transportation projects. So you can use the funds to actually administer the STIF program itself, as well as administering the projects that you fund with STIF. There are, and on our screen the top is cut off just a little bit. I'm not sure what you all are seeing, but I've brought that to Seth's attention. So purpose and use of STIF, the areas of emphasis. So you'll hear me use a couple different terms to talk about these areas of emphasis. In statute, the legislature highlighted 7 areas where qualified entities are required to report on how they're spending their formula funds or how they're allocating their formula funds to improve services in these areas. Only one of them has a specific required amount that's attached to it, but most certainly these are areas of emphasis or criteria that we're going to be looking for and asking you to tell us about in your STIF plans as well as in your reporting. So they are increasing, and about 3 or 4 of them have areas of overlap as they're related to improving service to low-income households. The first is increasing the frequency of bus service schedules in communities with a high percentage of low-income households, expanding bus routes and services to reach those same communities, programs to reduce fares for public transportation in communities with a high percentage of low income, procuring buses powered by natural gas, electricity, or other low or no emission propulsion methods, and that's in particular in areas with populations greater than 200,000. The other 3 areas are improving frequency and reliability of service connections between communities, inside and outside of a qualified entity's service area, coordination of public transportation service providers to reduce fragmentation in the provision of service, and the 7th one, which was added to law in the 2018 legislative session, is programs to provide student transit services for students in grades 9 through 12. And in that one in particular, well, we'll get into more details on that one shortly. Any questions? And I'll pause for a minute here to see if we have any questions about purpose. Okay, moving along. The 2020, so HB 2017 established that the STIF will be allocated across 4 funds as shown on the graphic, with 90% allocated by formula, 5% allocated by a discretionary statewide competitive grant process, 4% to improving intercommunity services also administered through a competitive statewide process, and 1% for a technical resource center to support rural providers or providers in rural areas, as well as to cover ODOT's administrative costs for administering the program. Fund eligibility. So qualified entities are eligible to receive and distribute formula funds. They are mass transit districts, transportation districts, counties without either a mass transit or transportation district, and Indian tribes. Then there's a second type of provider, which is defined in statute as public transportation service providers. They're eligible to receive formula funds through qualified entities but may also apply directly for discretionary funds. PTSPs are qualified entities or cities, counties, special districts, intergovernmental entities, or other political subdivisions or public corporations, isn't that a mouthful, that provide public transportation services. While nonprofit transit providers may not apply for STIF funds, they may provide transit services as a contractor or a vendor to a public transportation service provider. The same is true with private transportation service providers. I'm going to pause for a minute because I see a Region 2 question. So public corporation is defined as an independent entity formed by legislative action, serving a public purpose, and under exclusive public management control. Public transportation services are defined as any form of passenger transportation, either public or privately owned, which provides service to the general public on a regular and continuing basis, not including charter, sightseeing, or exclusive school bus service. So we're going to pause here for a minute. Oh goodness, I think we have about 3 questions. Can you go up to?
I think the first question is from Jennifer. How to provide service to grades 9 through 12 without violating STA certs and assurances?
Okay, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question, but it is providing public transportation service to students in grades through 12. So there's, I think, a lot of different options for how to do that. You might have a route that goes past schools. You might have a route that extends later into the evening to better serve students who are going home from activities. You might have a student bus pass program. So those would be a few ways. If there's more specifics and particulars to those questions, pose that to your RTC and we'll get that addressed later.
Second question is, can we use first round funds to match an existing 5310 award for vehicles to be purchased before June 30th?
Of 2018?
2019.
Of 2019. Yes, I don't see a reason why you couldn't do that.
Okay. Next question is, does the requirement for vehicles to be electric or CNG apply to the vehicles outside the urban growth boundary with over 200,000 population? So,
I think maybe you're over-analyzing that. I think it's generally if you're a transit provider in an area with populations greater than 200,000, that's something the legislature is interested in getting reporting on, whether you're purchasing vehicles with those alternative propulsion types.
and Jennifer again, are cities eligible if they do not currently provide public transportation service?
That is a great question. The way the rules read and how we've interpreted the rules, if you are going to provide public transportation, that would make you a public transportation service provider. So you needn't be a current provider to meet the definition. You still have all the other requirements in terms of having projects that come from local plans, but we'll be talking about that more in the future.
Are you ready for more questions?
Do we have more based on eligibility still? Okay.
PSTP, or that is the QE, implemented service expansion, June, based on STIF availability. Is this considered expansion or maintenance of service?
So if I understand the question correctly, service expansion started in June of 2018 or June of 2019. Either way, I think we would make the call. You're eligible to start spending against STIF funds as of the effective date of the rules, which was July 1, 2018, even though you, at the earliest you could receive formula funds won't be until April 2019. But you could spend now against STIF funds at your own risk. If a project is approved that includes the work that you're starting to do now, then you're able to reimburse yourself for those expenditures. Technically, June would be outside that window, but I think that's one of those conditions where you look at it and you're like, yeah, that's close enough. But we'll see. And why would you do that to us? Come on, guys, wait till July.
Okay.
Okay?
That's all for now.
Okay. So we'll keep moving. I was going through the definition of public transportation services. General public is an important part of that definition. So client-only transportation providers can be governmental or private agencies that offer transportation to limited groups of individuals. Client-only providers are not eligible to receive STIF funds if the proposed use of the STIF is to pay for services that are not open to the general public. So some examples might include of providers that would not be eligible: a mental health department of a county that provides a limited transportation service just to their clients, or a city agency operating a senior center with transportation services for seniors. Nonprofits or private might also have client-only services. For example, a social service agency offering transportation services to their clients. In all of those examples, the thing that they have in common is that the transportation services are not open to the general public. However, if there's client-only agencies participating in a planned and coordinated community transportation program, those agencies could be eligible. If the coordinated transportation system kind of looked at from the big picture would be open to the general public and marketed to the public as public transportation, I think the level of coordination and participation of client-only providers would need to be detailed in the area's service delivery plan, and the amount of funds that individual agencies qualified for could be associated with their levels of participation in such a coordinated plan.
I've got a new question. Is there a cap to the amount of STIF for administrative functions?
No, there is no limit to the amount of STIF for administrative functions. Fund eligibility. So as I mentioned earlier, nonprofit public transportation service providers are not eligible to receive so-called pass-through funds of STIF. You can, however, continue to provide public transportation services as a vendor to either a qualified entity or a PTSP. Either a qualified entity or a PTSP would need to be the one to propose a project, receive the funds, procure the contractor, provide contract oversight, and manage the project. So this is an issue that we've heard a lot about, and there's a lot of concerns about it statewide. In the 2018 legislative session, it was put in front of the legislature, or in front of the Joint Committee on Transportation, a proposal to expand the definition of PTSPs to include nonprofits, and the Joint Committee failed to take that up in this last session. So this is a statutory requirement that ODOT is operating under, but has basically determined a path forward or a process by which nonprofits could continue to provide services, because we understand there are many areas of the state where that is the only public transportation services that is provided by nonprofits.
We have a couple questions from Region 5.
Okay.
Will RPTD have a vendor contract template, and is it safe to assume that a vendor would be in third-party contractor status?
Don't know about the vendor contract template. So the way that it would work is that's something we consider. So whoever is the local agency, they would need to follow their own procurement or contracting processes in order to contract with the vendor. And so that is how that should be handled. I think we are planning to put together some information related to best practices, but the vendor, the template is a good idea, and we'll definitely consider that. I think the thing that we want to be careful of is supplanting, saying that this is the state's way of preferring to do things, when in fact we want you to actually implement this consistent with your local policies and procedures. Third-party contractor status. I'm not sure about that. I don't fully understand that question, but that's something that we could research. I think the answer is yes, but we'll follow up on that one. So I know this is hard to see on the screen, which is why you should have in your packets a handout that is the map that shows the qualified entities. You'll hear us talk about, and you'll see in the rules, the term area of responsibility. So that means the geographic area for which each qualified entity is responsible for distributing STIF formula fund monies. So for a qualified entity that is a county, so that's the counties that are in yellow, the area of responsibility is the geographic area within the county's jurisdictional boundaries. For a QE, that's a mass transit or transportation district that shares a continuous boundary with the county. The area of responsibility is that geographic area within the district's boundary. So, for example, Grant County has the Grant County Transportation District has the exact same limits as the county limits. So you see those counties highlighted in light green. And for a qualified entity that's a mass transit or a transportation district that does not share a continuous jurisdictional boundary with the county, the area of responsibility is the geographic area within the jurisdictional boundaries of the county or counties in which any part of the district is located. So on this map, the counties that are shown in white are the responsibility of the mass transit or transportation district that's located within the county. So you'll see Lane Transit District is responsible for all of Lane County. Salem Area Mass Transit is responsible for both Marion and Polk, and so forth. So it puts the transit and transport, it's folks that are already familiar with the STF program would recognize that qualified entities, the definition is exactly the same as the definition for an STF agency, and the responsibilities are quite similar in terms of the processes that need to occur. And then the other qualified entity that's listed on the map is the 9 tribes. And we're seeing a question popping up from Region 2. So I'll pause here for a second. Type faster, Arla. Mark, I'm not sure who's typing. Maybe it's Lee. Lee, are you typing for them?
Would a campus bus service that provides service to the public be eligible for STIF funds?
Okay, so that is an interesting question. I think the answer is yes, because that would be open to the general public. The question of, you didn't ask this question, but the other question to be asked is, who is the project owner? Is it a public transportation service provider, or if it's, when you say campus, it's a university or college, and it's possible that some universities or college would meet the definition for public transportation service provider depending on, as a public corporation, depending on how they were formed. So there's two possible routes there for that. Advisory committees. Oh no, not a cough. So when considering the requirements for advisory committees, it's really important that you look at the requirements in the general section of the rules, which is what we're going to cover now. Advisory committee requirements are also found in the formula fund section, as well as the discretionary fund section. So one of the interesting things we discovered really early when we were working on the rules is that the advisory committee requirement for projects does extend to the discretionary funds, which is quite different from the STIF work. So each qualified entity is required to appoint an advisory committee to advise and recommend to the qualified entity on the prioritization of formula fund projects, whether to fund discretionary projects, opportunities to coordinate STIF projects with other transportation programs to improve service delivery and reduce gaps in service. And they can also make recommendations to the QE on policies to ensure that public transportation service providers are expending funds consistent with the approved projects in the STIF plan, and on policies to ensure that PTSP projects don't fragment services. And we're going to try to tamp my cough down. Advisory committee bylaws. The QE is responsible for committee bylaws. There's quite a lengthy list of requirements that you'll find in section 3.0 of the general rules. There needs to be a purpose, number of members, membership criteria, terms of office, meeting schedules, procedures, duties, fostering public involvement and compliance with Oregon public meeting and records laws as applicable, a process to review project proposals for all STIF programs using the criteria identified in the rules, as well as the definition of a high percentage of low-income households for the committee's evaluation of proposed projects. I'll just very briefly highlight that the definition of low-income household is found in rule. The definition of what constitutes a high percentage is left to each of the qualified entities to define. We wanted that to be a very local decision and a local consideration, considering how different communities are across Oregon. 2 or more qualified entities may appoint a joint advisory committee. In doing so, it requires a written agreement between the QEs, and each QE remains independently responsible for implementation unless there's a broader agreement between the entities for joint management of the funds. Copies of bylaws, meeting minutes, and notices must be published by the QE and available for public review within a reasonable period of time. Now turning to committee composition. There's a minimum size, and this is very similar to what's in the STF rules, based on the qualified entity type, with the smaller QEs or more rural QEs requiring having a fewer number of committee members. Members need to represent diverse interests, perspectives, geographies, and area population demographics. Appointees should be knowledgeable about public transportation needs and represent one or more of the constituencies that are listed in the rule. There are 3 constituencies that are required to be represented. Sorry, I got distracted by Region 4. Minimum composition. Somebody needs to be on the advisory committee that can represent the perspectives of low-income households, a perspective of seniors and or people with disabilities, and a public transit provider. That public transit provider requirement, it can either be a PTSP as defined in rule, or it could be a nonprofit public transit provider. Now, because a public transit provider is one of the requirements in rule, somebody who's serving in that function whose agency might also have projects in for consideration does not have a conflict of interest by serving on the committee, participating in discussions, and voting on the recommendation for projects to put forward. Part of that is because it is a requirement in rule, but also because that committee is not a decider. That committee is recommending to the QE governing body, who's then in turn submitting that to the state, and eventually the Oregon Transportation Commission will make that decision.
We have a few questions.
Yes.
From Jennifer, are all meetings of advisory committee required to have public comment period on the agendas?
No, I wouldn't say that that's a requirement unless that's something that you put in your bylaws. They are required to be public meetings, and it definitely is a best practice to collect public comments, whether you have an oral public comment period or you collect comments in writing and provide those to committee members. That's up to local discretion.
From Region 4, will Rail and Public Transit Division provide a template for bylaws?
If we do, it's probably not going to be in the short term. We have to share that we are in a very similar situation to you in that we don't have any new staff. I've been assigned from another position to project management this process. So it's me plus some consultant support, plus our other staff who are adding this work on top of their other jobs. So we are somewhat limited on what we can do in this first funding cycle. But I think we will definitely consider that request. I know that the Oregon Transit Association is collecting examples of bylaws and STIF plans and other content from transit providers across the state and posting them on their website. So that is one resource. The state can't vouch for those. We haven't reviewed them to see if they meet all of the requirements, but that is one place you might look for resources in the short term.
From Region 4 again, can you explain the options for combining the STF and STIF committees?
Ooh, good question. So advisory committees, this advisory committee can be a standalone committee or it can be part of a larger committee. What is important is that you look at the advisory committee requirements for all of your committees if you're combining them, and make sure that you're meeting the requirements and rule, that you have the minimum composition requirements met, that people are coming from geographies as appropriate and so forth, and that so you might do things where you have combined committee meetings where you have topics that pertain to both committees, but then you have times on your agenda where perhaps you're closing out the STF portion of the meeting and opening the STIF portion of the meeting, and then that would be the time where you're considering STIF projects.
From Region 5, a Region 5 county intends to use as a high percentage of low-income households any community where such households exceed the state average. Does that seem acceptable?
Yes.
From Region 1.
One of the things that you'll see, we're working on the STIF plan template and the STIF formula fund guidance document, which we'll be releasing no later than August 1st, hopefully a little bit earlier. And that will have guidance around this particular topic. And as a baseline, one of the things that we are recommending folks consider is exactly what you've highlighted, is does that community exceed the state average? So that's one option.
One more from Region 1. Can you clarify requirements or expectations for STIF advisory committees to include public transportation service providers from out of the QE's area of responsibility, out of district?
So I would say that there's not a strict requirement that you include multiple PTSPs from out of district. If you're asking my opinion about best practices, then I think certainly you would want to have that kind of representation as you look at the larger mix of stakeholders and engagement, and making sure that you have the right folks around the table that can best advise on a regional public transportation plan or STIF plan.
From Jennifer, can bylaws define quorum as one person due to lack of attendance?
I highly doubt it. Bylaws, again, are a local requirement, so you can choose to define the quorum how you wish, but I also, I'm probably going to regret saying this, you also got to apply the giggle factor to it. Does that really pass the giggle test? And I understand that some committees might be as small as 3 people, but it's not a requirement that we have, but I think in terms of best professional practices, you're going to look at least 2 as a quorum in that case.
And Jennifer, as a clarifying question, just making sure 90% of tax dollars from each county will return to each county. Is that correct?
I'm going to return to that when we get to the allocation calculation, so I'm going to ask you to pause that now.
Do you want to keep taking questions?
I'll keep taking questions on advisory committees.
Okay. A district in Region 5 has been advised by their association that they should have draft bylaws reviewed by legal counsel before adoption. Is that a district thing, or should all qualified entities be taking this into consideration?
You know, I think it's up to each individual QE how they want to handle that. If you want your legal counsel to look at it and compare it to rules just to make sure that you're hitting all the marks, that's definitely one option. You might also ask your regional transit coordinators to have a look at it with you. They can also give you some advice on that.
That's all we have.
Okay, so Jennifer, keep that question in mind. You might have to remind us as we get a little farther in, but we'll try to come back to it. Have Seth jot a note as we go. So reporting requirements. So these are the reporting requirements are another topic that you'll find different requirements in each division of the rules. These are the requirements that pertain to all of the funds. And some of these are statutory, again, and some of them are additional ones in rules, but mostly they are statutory. This was one of the legislature's really big areas of emphasis, which is, there are multiple areas, but the emphasis on expanding or providing new service in serving areas with low-income communities, and also accountability. And this recognition that this revenue, these funds, are not an entitlement, that you need to have a plan for how you're going to spend the money. Tell us what your plan is. Does the plan meet the intent of the legislation? And then tell us how you did. And so as I heard a number of the committee members say multiple times, as with new funding comes additional accountability, and that is how you see that coming through in these reporting requirements. So one of the things that's unique to this fund is that an annual report on actions taken by public transportation service providers to mitigate the impacts of the STIF tax on low-income passengers. So I think there's multiple ways to address that, whether you have a low-income fare program, whether you've determined that your area in general has a high percentage of low-income households, and therefore you keep your fares very low, or you don't have fares. All of those are methods and options for mitigating the impacts. Your adopted annual budget for the upcoming fiscal year, the results of any relevant financial audits of the QE and PTSPs, And ODOT may withhold future distributions of STIF monies from a QE that fails to submit reports.
We have a question from Region 4. Will the reporting be done in Optus?
Excellent question, and I think the answer to that is yes. As much as possible, and I have to tell you that we're sort of building the program as we go, so we're maybe a half a step ahead of you all in this process, if I'm going to be honest about it. But as we started doing the STIF plan template, we've been as much as we can thinking upstream and downstream and thinking about what we're going to need to report to the legislature, thinking about what providers are already doing, how you're already doing it, to try to minimize to the extent that we can the impact on you for having to implement new processes or learn new things or do things in a different way, yet balancing that against the accountability and reporting requirements. So it is our intent that reporting will continue. This reporting will be done in Optus, and we'll be looking at, in the months ahead, we'll be looking at how we integrate the reporting requirements of STIF with our existing reporting requirements. I'm going to wait for these couple of questions to come in because I will then be moving on to withholding of funds after this. Everyone's favorite topic.
From Region 2, is there a separate quarterly report?
TBD. Yeah, to be determined. I think our first goal would be to integrate it with the existing quarterly report. So we want to look at what is the most efficient and effective way to do that. So that is something we'll be digging into in the months ahead.
From Region 4, in a joint management situation, who is responsible for reporting, the service provider or the qualified entity? Who is responsible for the budget?
Okay, so a joint management situation would be joint between qualified entities. If a qualified entity were to choose to contract with a PTSP to do their work on their behalf, then that's a different situation. So the QE is ultimately responsible for reporting and for the budget. The process for how that occurs and who submits that presumably would be determined by your joint management agreement and what you have spelled out in your requirements. We would have to talk about, because I know just enough about this to be dangerous, that who actually hits the send button may or may not matter when it comes to reporting. So I'm going to leave that in the question to be answered still column.
From Jennifer, describe mitigation to low-income passengers versus or in addition to low-income households.
You're asking me all the good questions. That, I think, is one that I want to set to the side and come back to when we get into that topic a little bit more. And I think that's also one where I would need to look specifically at the rules, because I think the rules say that it's mitigation for low-income households, but now I can't remember. Low-income passengers. It's a good question. So one of the challenges through this process has been the fact that the legislation speaks to low-income households, which can be limiting because you're, on a broader community perspective, you're wanting to serve low-income passengers, you're wanting to help them get from their households to work, and how do you do that? And so part of what we've been looking at in guidance is how do you make that conversion from household to passengers, and how do you address that? So it is a challenging issue, and I think that's probably a topic we're going to have to spend more time on. We've been talking about doing a training on methods and options for calculating high percentage of low-income households. and mitigations. And so I think this is one where I think I've said all I can say about that in this moment, but it's one to be considered for a future training or future guidance. Withholding of funds, so general. We can withhold payment of STIF monies under certain conditions. Failure to use STIF funds in accordance with laws, rules, or terms of your STIF plan or agreement. Failure to submit required reporting, any unresolved audit findings related to accounting for STIF monies, any unresolved compliance review finding related to the use of STIF monies. And we have an appeal process where a QA can appeal ODOT's decision to withhold formula fund monies. And that site OAR is listed. Similar, I think what we've talked about so far internally is that we really plan to operate very similar to how we do now, where we receive the quarterly reports, we look at the work that's being done compared to the STIF plan that's submitted, and does it look, reasonably consistent. If it doesn't, your RTC, your staff is going to be contacting the provider to ask questions, ask for clarification, get more information, and if it's determined that something isn't compliant, we'll look at whether there's a process for making an adjustment to future payments or so forth. Our goal is not to be punitive, but is to help transit providers to be successful and to spend the funds in accordance with the rules.
We have a question that goes back to reporting.
Mm-hmm.
Is that from Jennifer? Is our annual adopted budget sufficient, or will we have to prepare a separate budget for just the STIF funds?
No, it's the annual adopted budget.
And is there going to be a fee connect if you are the pass-through agency?
So I think that question is asking if the QE can charge some sort of administrative fees for administering a contract with their PTSP. Is that the question? I'm going to assume that it is. And the answer is that is a local decision and something to be worked out between the QE and the PTSP. There's nothing in rule that would preclude that. Okay, so other general rules to review. These are the pieces that we haven't reviewed in detail and won't today, which are the audit and compliance requirements. We will be adding STIF program to our current compliance review processes. We do not yet have a compliance review handbook or policies and procedures related to that. That's something that will be developed in the future, but you would expect it to be, based on the rules, very similar to what you're already doing and what we're already looking at for compliance reviews. There's also the accounting requirements. There's more content about qualified entity management and joint management of funds, as well as the appeal procedures as part of Section 5.0. Okay, so with that, we have covered the high level of the general rules. Now I'm going to spend the most time, again, on the formula fund rules, because that is the solicitation that's coming up the earliest, and then I'll also touch at a high level on discretionary. So getting into the formula fund rules, the key elements, I want to talk with you about the funding cycle and calculations, the planning requirements, the sub-allocation method, decision making, and then a bit on reporting and accountability. So again, another graphic that there's no way you can read on your screen, which is why you have a fact sheet that has the schedule. This is essentially the same schedule that we published in February, but now that we know precisely when the OTC adopted the rules, it has the more specific dates and review periods. So as I mentioned earlier, the formula fund solicitation is expected to be out no later than August 1st, with the first application date of November 1st. And then there's a second potential application due date opportunity 6 months later on May 1st. Now, the decision to have these two due dates came about through our stakeholder engagement with the Oregon Transit Association, with our Public Transportation Advisory Committee, as well as the STIF Rules Advisory Committee. There are some transit providers across the state that are very eager to get their applications in and get the revenue flowing and get service improvements happening as concurrently as possible with the assessment of the taxes, which started on July 1 of 2018. There are other providers that we recognize have very limited resources, and it's going to take some time to do the planning work and get prepared and submit the application. The 6-month gap between the two also helps to give us time to stagger our other solicitations that our section will be running. So that is the schedule. There was a question about whether a provider could submit, part of a plan or a limited plan on the first due date and then come back with a more robust and complete plan for the rest of the biennium on the second due date. No, you would need to submit a complete STIF plan. We need to consider it in its totality. So it's a pick one date or the other for submittal.
Will you take an audit question from Region 4? Will audit requirements be passed on to nonprofit contractors who may not be subject to a single audit requirements?
Nonprofits are contractors or vendors. So I think the question is, how do you treat, and I don't know the answer to this question, how do you treat your other vendors or contractors? But that is a question that we will look at and address later. So going back to the formula, or going to the formula fund calculation method. So in April, ODOT prepared an updated formula fund allocation estimate, which is an estimate that's to be used for STIF planning purposes for this funding cycle. We have characterized it as a very conservative planning level estimate so that qualified entities have some idea of a target as they prepare their STIF plans in order to receive their share of formula funds. The forecast is conservative because the tax is new and we don't have any historical data to predict future revenues. The level of taxpayer compliance is also uncertain. We are assuming that the compliance level will be 75% for the first quarter, with increasing levels of compliance as we continue. You might recall that there was a previous version of revenue that was estimated by the Legislative Fiscal Office during the 2017 legislative session. That estimate was, we'll just say, much less conservative than our estimate. They assumed 100% payer compliance. They did not subtract Department of Revenue administrative expenses, which we have now taken into consideration. And theirs was also based on a 10-year annual average. So more about the actual calculation method. So the first step in our process is that we determine the qualified entity payroll shares by using the most current annual payroll data from the Oregon Employment Department, with adjustments to ensure that each qualified entity receives $100,000 minimum per year. So what that data allows us to do is to, as to one of the earlier questions, it allows us to collect data, or to look at data, we don't collect it, that's based on the employee's report to work location. And that's how we determine the shares that should be allocated to each qualified entity. Then as the revenues are collected by the Department of Revenue and come to ODOT, we multiply the net total of the formula fund by the QE payroll shares. This is after pulling the 90% out for formula and the 5%, 4%, and 1% out for the other programs. As I mentioned earlier, so as that revenue comes in, We apply those calculations. If you have an approved STIF plan, we then disperse that revenue based on those allocation shares. So money in, money out. Qualified entities can start spending against the formula funds as of July 1, which I mentioned earlier. And then upon an approved STIF plan, the QE can reimburse themselves for STIF expenses for an approved project. So when you're submitting your STIF plan, you're going to be asked to specify the start date of your plan. And so July 1, 2018 is the earliest possible start date.
We have a question from Region 2.
Oh, I have one other thing, two other things on this. So applicants for formula funds, because we have such a conservative estimate, we're actually asking you to develop STIF plans that exceed your allocation amounts by about 30% in the event that revenues exceed this conservative estimate. That's just a recommendation. You can choose a higher or lower amount, but ODOT can only distribute STIF formula funds consistent with the amount specified in an approved plan. So if revenues exceed your STIF plan budget amount, we have to stop dispersing the funds at that time. Now that money is still sitting there for you, and on the next STIF funding cycle, that is added to your estimate or your estimated amount. You can also budget for some portion of your STIF funds to be carried forward. Say you're planning a major capital investment, a new admin building, and it's going to take you multiple sources and multiple STIF cycles to have enough money to do that. So you can budget for that as part of a multi-phase project and roll that funding forward.
So I think you just answered their second question, was can STIF funds be set aside in reserve to fund plans in the future?
Yes. It can also be used, you can also build in an operations contingency to that. There's no maximum or minimum requirements for that. You just need to specify what you're doing.
Region 2 also asked, what amount does Department of Revenue charge?
That is an excellent question. We are working off of a combined estimate that they provided us for multiple ODOT programs currently. We continue to ask DOR for an estimate that breaks out STIF separately from the other programs, and to date we do not have that estimate. We have estimated, and I'm going to get the number wrong, but somewhere in the $5 million range for the first biennium. Under statute, they're allowed to take their administration amount off the top. There's no specified upper limit, so it's for collections and compliance. So that is something that our leadership is continuing to push for with DOR, though, to get a better number for that.
Is this the right place to return to Jennifer's question about 90% of funds returning to the county where they were generated?
Yes. And so the answer, Jennifer, is yes. And if you look at generation as where the employee reports to work. Now we know that there's in some areas of the state, there's some pretty big differences where people live and where people report to work. That's part of why there's some of the coordination requirements that exist in statute. And I'm hearing some really good things from around the state where qualified entities are looking at their travel sheds and working with their PTSPs, and there's some cases where funding is proposed for contracts or agreements with other QEs in order to help get employees from areas outside of the QE's jurisdictional authority, into jobs in that community. So that's exactly the kind of coordination and analysis we're really hoping to see a lot more of. So bravo to all of you who are already doing that.
That's all we have.
Okay. So now we turn from, excuse me, what the money is to what you got to do to get the money, which is the STIF plan content. So I think the first thing I want to emphasize with this, a plan is what is specified in statute. But when you look at what's required to be in the plan, it's not like a plan like a land use plan, like most planning planners think of plans. This is more like a program of projects, if you will, and then talking about various factors related to those projects and how the benefits that are associated with those projects. So qualified entities must submit a STIF plan to ODOT in order to receive formula funds. Your STIF plans will function both as an application and as an agreement. So part of the reason why you see us asking for so much detail up front in the plans is that's it. This is your agreement. So as well. So once the commission approves the plan, and whatever effective date they tie to that, you are off and running, and the money flow begins. Projects that are funded by STIF formula funds must be derived from local plans. Local plan is a defined term in the rules, and existing local plans may be used to inform STIF plans if they meet those local plan requirements. So a few examples of plans that might meet that requirement are transit development plans, transportation system plans, coordinated plans, regional, MPO regional transportation plans. So the local plan definition summary. So it's a local or regional public transportation plan. It can include adopted policies developed and approved by the governing body of a qualified entity, a PTSP, or an MPO. You see the examples listed there again. So the reason that the word policy is in there is because, for example, some jurisdictions have policies that say once there's a certain number of riders boarding at this bus stop, there's this level of amenity that's going to be provided. So that policy points to capital improvements or capital projects that should be funded. So that policy, in combination with a different plan like a TSP, those two things get the job done. Now, the local plan, you don't need to have, with all of the plan requirements, you don't need to have all of those in a single plan. You can, for example, have a plan that calls for a capital improvement program to be developed that implements the plan. And then when you develop your capital improvement plan, when it's adopted, it is tied, it is bootstrapped to your previously approved plan. So those are a couple of different scenarios. This is an area where our regional transit coordinators have been meeting with QEs and PTSPs to talk about what plans do you have and doing sort of an informal assessment and inventory to see how compliant they are or to identify areas where they may not be compliant. So the base conditions are to have a planning horizon of at least 4 years. It can be longer than that. It should have an existing and future conditions analysis, so identifying the population that you're serving and the population you anticipate to serve in the future, where they live, work, and where they want to travel, and an inventory of your transit services as well as nearby and connecting transit services or potentially connecting services. Prioritize lists of transit improvements and capital projects. There's many different ways, of course, to achieve that. It doesn't have to be project specific necessarily if you're using some policies to help you prioritize those kinds of improvements. And then identify opportunities to coordinate public transportation services with other agencies. And this is, again, that you see coordinate capitalized, and that is because coordination is a defined term in rules, and I will get to that definition in a moment. So that's, again, kind of pointing to the coordination requirements of the law and reducing fragmentation of services.
Good questions from Region 2. If fair charge is part of the STIF plan, does a new fair ordinance need to be adopted first, or can it come after?
So I think if you have something that is a policy or that is in your plan that points to whatever your fair review process is, that's sufficient. The actual ordinance that specifies the fair, I think that could come at any time.
Okay. And how do the present sub-allocation rules provide for regional travel shed transit funding across jurisdictions?
That's a good question. Why do I feel like I know who might have asked that question? I want to set that one aside and come back to it when we talk about sub-allocation.
Okay.
Because, or actually maybe I don't need to. No, I am. I'm having a great meeting with myself right now. And I guess some clarification on that question, provide for regional travel shed. Like, is the question, does it take travel into consideration? Can a QE take that into consideration when developing sub-allocation? I just want to clarify that that's the question, and then we'll come back. Was there any other, or should I move on at this moment?
Region 2 is typing. The rules related to the sub-allocation formula require revenues to be returned to the area where the payroll tax was generated. But say this is a starting point. How much is the proportionate share rubric a requirement?
That is an excellent question. I'm definitely taking those two together and pushing them into the sub-allocation content, which is coming right up. So a STIF plan prepared by the QE needs to include at least one biennium in this funding cycle, but future funding cycles could be 1 to 2 biennia. So to clarify, in this first funding cycle, you can only apply for funding for this upcoming biennium, so through June 30th of 2021. In future cycle, and that's because we wanted folks to providers to sort of start to learn the system, to get their feet under them, to get everything in order. We anticipate that we will all have some learning through this first process, and that there could be tweaks to the policies, procedures, possibly even rules during this process. And so in future biennia, though, providers could apply for funding for up to 2 biennia. The plan also must consider the QE's area of responsibility, so in district, out of district, for those particular providers that are mass transit or transportation districts. It needs to define and identify communities with a high percentage of low-income households. And it needs to do 2 things related to sub-allocation. And this is really, the bold is definitely for emphasis. It has to describe the sub-allocation method, both the method for formula funds and the process for developing the method. The rules are somewhat emphatic on this. The method must be developed in coordination with PTSPs or potential PTSPs. In this context, in the context of the rules, coordination means to meet and develop sub-allocation methods, plans, programs, and schedules with other PTSPs, and you recall QEs are PTSPs, with the intent of developing efficient and seamless public transportation services and reducing gaps in service. So the sub-allocation method is an area that we've been hearing about a lot across the state. And there's kind of 2 things that I really want to emphasize, which is that this revenue, we have to go back to that legislative intent, that formula funds are not an entitlement, that QEs have a responsibility for running a process and handling distribution. They have a responsibility to coordinate with their public transportation service providers. Now, public transportation service providers, on the other hand, say cities, this isn't like other kinds of funds or highway funds where it's you get this amount based on these factors. So the question related to the rubric. So you'll notice a lot of very interesting, well, that's something that got messed up on this slide. It looks great on my handout though. So to the extent possible, and using the best available data, each sub-allocation must be proportionate to the employee payroll tax generated to each PTSP area. So I know some of you find this language incredibly confusing and frustrating. So what we're trying to say is use the best data you have to the extent that you have this data available to you. And we do have, and it is in one of your handouts, guidance on sources of data. The employment department does have payroll data by county and by city for most cities. For some cities where they have a major employer and not many other industries where to reveal payroll amounts would reveal too much about a particular business, they may not be able to release that data. So the statutory sort of intent around revenue going back to the place generally from which it came is a starting point for project decision making. Again, not an entitlement, and the decision criteria might affect the prioritization of the awards. So if you're looking at and balancing against serving a high percentage of low-income households, and you're looking at where revenues are and where people are coming from and going to, all of those factors drive decision making. So no one PTSP should reasonably expect that every dollar that's generated in their community is precisely going to come back to their community. It is, again, a starting point for the process. And you can consider other criteria. So where we get to the travel shed, go back to the travel shed question that was asked, a qualified entity working with its PTSPs might decide that certain data is a great starting point, but because of travel patterns and the volumes of people traveling between communities, that they want to place an emphasis on projects that address those needs. So that's a local option on a local decision, and exactly the kinds of conversations we would encourage you to have in your communities.
So I think you just answered the question about how much is the proportionate share a requirement as a starting point. Region 2 also clarified their other question about sub-allocation. How do the sub-allocation method rules encourage funding of travel shed needs when those travel sheds cross jurisdictions?
I don't know that I don't think that the sub-allocation, somebody is not muted. Get them, Seth. I don't think that the sub-allocation method really does anything to encourage funding of travel shed needs. I think that's touched on in other areas related to filling gaps, related to coordination in particular.
Okay. From Jennifer, are we obligated to implement prioritized lists in consecutive order, or can we jump over to a service with the intention to implement the full plan eventually?
That is an excellent question. So I don't think that the state cares that much about your prioritization of projects. I think that it is more helpful to the communities, or to the community, to know what the prioritization of projects are. I think if you know that, so you can have projects that are prioritized, but the schedule for implementation might dictate that you do different things at different times. So I would still say that doing that is consistent with the plan. Where that gets a little bit tricky, and in your STIF plan template and your applications, you'll be asked to specify whether a project is on the 100% list or the 130% list. So I think where you would, and this is, I guess, the best practice advice, it's a local decision, but be more cautious is when you're starting to get into your 130% project list where you're jumping between 100 to 130.
From Region 2, can community mean a portion of a community?
Oh, community. There's, community is one of those terms that is used throughout, and we've intentionally not defined community. We've left it to you all to define community within your local context. So the answer is yes. There are many, many, many different ways to define community, and we did not want to, we wanted to continue to provide that local flexibility.
From Region 4, can you briefly explain the 100% versus 130% lists?
Yeah, so one of the handouts in your packet is a allocation estimate. And that allocation estimate has estimated formula fund revenues by fiscal year during this upcoming funding cycle. The 100% list would be budget for your STIF plan up to the amount that's specified on that allocation calculation. The 130% list would be if you choose to budget for projects or plan for projects that exceed the 100% amount by 30%. Again, that's going back to our estimate being very conservative, and we think 100% is the basement. Like, we would be extremely shocked if revenues did not meet the 100% estimate amount.
Okay.
Okay, back to the larger STIF plan contents list. So I want to pause for a minute and say that one of the things that's important to consider is that the STIF plan is developed by the qualified entity. There's 7 sections in the STIF plan template, and the project section is by far the more robust one. So qualified entities will be responsible for running these processes of soliciting projects, if you will, from their PTSPs. So what the PTSP is required to submit to the QE looks different from what the QE will actually be submitting to ODOT. So I just wanted to mention that now so that when you start to see the STIF plan template, that you're having an understanding of which portions of it that the PTSPs will do. The other thing that I'll mention really briefly is once we have the STIF plan template completed, it's an online form that you can save as you go along. We'll be also completing a PTSP project application template. So it's basically just taking out Section 6 with adding a few things that qualified entities have the option of using to solicit project applications from their PTSPs. They don't have to use it, but it's a template that we're providing to help facilitate that process. So project descriptions, a summary of planned and prior expenditures. So obviously in this first funding cycle, you don't have any prior STIF expenditures to talk about, but you remember the 7 criteria / areas of emphasis. In your future STIF plan submittals, you'll need to identify how you allocated funds across those 7 criteria area, and that's something that ODOT will be able to help you with in terms of how we set up our reporting. So we'll be collecting that data from you. The amount of funding allocated to the 7 areas of emphasis, which I cover, your advisory committee information, your accountability methods, which is how are you setting up your systems to make sure that you're spending the funds and providing the service consistent with law and rule. The record of the governing body's adoption of the STIF plan, and it doesn't apply this cycle, but in the future, if your QE had issues, compliance issues what are the remediation strategies? I did a bad thing, and this is how I'm going to make sure I don't do a bad thing next time. So the project section. All the basics, name, description, funding level, and budget. Description of how the project will improve, expand, or maintain existing service. The amount of funding you're requesting, and the anticipated benefits and measurable outcomes specific to those 7 criteria or areas of emphasis. The local plans from which the project was derived, and how the project is consistent with the Oregon Public Transportation Plan, which, while not adopted yet, should be in September. And then a minimum of 1% of your formula funds must be spent on student transit for grades 9 through 12 to the extent practicable.
We have a question from Region 4.
Okay.
What if a qualified entity ultimately does not receive enough STIF funds to implement the full 130% list included in the STIF plan agreement?
I'm not sure that I understand the question. If you don't get the money, you don't do the work. So I think in thinking about what you can actually do with the money, you might consider for your 130% list making it things that are more like capital or one-time projects, so that you're not banking on and signaling that you're going to potentially operate new services when that funding isn't a sure thing. Once we get past this first funding cycle, we should have a lot better idea of what the revenue flows will be. Our economists have done some analysis to look at what are the effects of the economy on this revenue stream, and it's actually a fairly robust revenue source that is unlikely to have large impacts. And don't ask me to explain that in any more detail, because you know the extent of my knowledge on that topic. So hopefully that helps. If not, ask a more detailed question and I'll give it another shot. Actually, I think there's one more topic I wanted to hit on in here. We talked about improved or new service versus maintaining an existing service, which also is tied closely to the issue of supplanting of local funds. So that is an area that there's some legislative intent around. We recently received a copy of an editorial letter that Senator Beyer, one of the co-chairs of the Joint Committee, wrote, and that is an area of great interest, and that's something that will be part of the considerations in approving STIF plans.
Region 4 has another question. Will unspent funds be carried over from one cycle to another?
Excellent question. So one of the things that we'll be doing is, I think it's a biennial reconciliation process where we'll look at what was the requested amount, how funds were actually spent, and if there is unspent funds, whether intentional through a project proposal or unintentional, then yes, those will get carried forward into the next cycle. Advisory Committee review of projects. So this is the Advisory Committee requirements that are specific to formula funds. So PTSPs would submit their project proposals to the QE's Advisory Committee for review. The Advisory Committee will review the projects according to the bylaws, including whatever the public meeting requirements are that were in your bylaws. The Advisory Committee recommends a prioritized list of projects and considering the following criteria. So the extent to which the project addresses the 7 criteria or areas of emphasis. Does the project maintain an existing productive service? Do project goals meet public transportation needs? Are the projects a responsible use of public funds? And there could be other factors that might be determined by the qualified entity or the advisory committee, such as geographic equity within that QE's area of responsibility.
We have a question from Jennifer. Can a route that directly services high school campus along with surrounding neighborhoods count as 1%, or does it need to be passes?
That can count as a 1%. I think the other piece to consider is that it's also an improvement or an expanded service. So if you have an existing route that's doing that, that would be a proposal to maintain something, not necessarily put more towards student transit for grades 9 through 12. So you could put more towards it by improving the frequency of service, extending the hours of service, etc. There's also a question of if you were to spend funding on, and we have several examples in our guidance document on ways to meet this that'll be coming out. So one of the questions or suggestions we have, which we think also fits, is if you're providing mobility training or education to schools to help students to learn what their options are. Hey, Jennifer, I answered your question before you even fully asked it. The answer is still yes.
And Region 5 had a question about vendor contractors versus subrecipients, but they said you could address it at the end. Is there a place where you'd rather address it?
I'll just go ahead and jump to that topic right now. This is an area, again, where we will be developing guidance on it. But I think the basic thing to understand is that there is a difference between a vendor/contractor and a subrecipient. A subrecipient is someone who's eligible to receive the funds because they meet the definition of either a QE or a PTSP. If you don't meet that definition, you technically are not a subrecipient. Funds cannot be passed through to you. Which then would potentially put you into the vendor or contractor category. So I think what changes for people from what they're currently doing, perhaps under other programs, is it's the agreement or contracting mechanism, whereas right now you may have a subrecipient grant agreement, but what you may need in the future is a contract. There might be some procurement process that's required depending on the dollar amount and what your local policies, what your QE policies are around procurement. So I think in practice, very little changes about the relationship and how you provide service, but I think it's more the mechanism that helps make it happen that's different.
Do projects need to meet all 7 criteria?
No. This is one of those super wiggly areas where the only one that's required is the student transit one, up to a minimum of 1%. All the others are areas of emphasis, areas where the legislature wants to see providers spending money, but it's not a requirement. You could have one project that hits multiple criteria. You could have a project that hits none of the criteria. All of those things are possible. However, if you have projects that aren't, if you come in with 0 projects meeting the criteria, that's probably a really bad idea. And your STIF plan could likely be recommended for rejection.
From Region 1, if a project like electric buses is one of the 7 criteria for evaluation, but is not specified in a local plan, does it qualify for funding?
I have to believe that buses are capital improvements that would be specified in the plan. If you're talking specifically, does your plan have to say the fuel type? I don't think so. I don't know. Yeah, I don't think that matters. I think your local plan can specify buses. I don't know if that's exactly what you're asking, but I think so. If it's not, ask another question that's more specific. Okay, so now well, nailed it. Thanks, Jason. That happens sometimes. But more often than not, that doesn't happen. Okay, so decision making and commission approval. So this is illustrating the decision process. So the advisory committee reviews and advises the qualified entity's governing body on project prioritizations. The governing body of the qualified entity, so that's their board of directors or whoever, their county commissioners, whoever their body is, approves the STIF plan. Now, the governing body of the qualified entity could approve a slate of projects that are different from what the advisory committee recommends. If they do that, they're required to notify those PTSPs of the reason or the rationale for not approving their project. And that's also part of what they would need to inform the state in their application. ODOT staff will then review the STIF plans for completeness. And if we find that there are sections that are missing or that there's things we don't understand, we will ask you to provide that additional information. So going back to that schedule that was in the early slides, you'll see a rather lengthy process. I think we've given ourselves a couple of months to get through the review of all the plans and get information packaged for PTAC's review. So at any time during that process, we could ask you for that additional information. PTAC has then reviews and determines whether to recommend STIF plans to the Oregon Transportation Commission. PTAC has decided that they will have a subcommittee that's charged with doing that more in-depth review, and then that subcommittee will make the recommendation to PTAC as a whole. So PTAC's recommendation to the OTC is whether to accept or reject PTAC's recommendation. PTAC can determine that they're going to recommend that a STIF plan is not approved. We have a process by which once PTAC makes that recommendation, that the qualified entity has 30 days to fix whatever PTAC has identified is wrong with the STIF plan, and PTAC will reconsider and then move that forward to the OTC. So that's part of what's baked into the process. So some of the reasons for commission rejection, which is covered in Section 25. The QE failed to establish or confer with an advisory committee, or the committee did not meet rule requirements. The plan is incomplete or does not adequately explain how it will accomplish project goals, including the accountability methods. And it does not contain the sections and elements listed in those very specific OARs. And you will find the STIF plan content requirements in the OARs to be very detailed. If you have questions about those, ask your RTCs. And the QA failed in a previous funding cycle, so again, this doesn't pertain this funding cycle. The QE failed to expend STIF formula funds in compliance with a prior approved STIF plan. There are some other examples of areas of emphasis that have been bubbling up that could be reasons for commission rejection. That's failure to develop an allocation method in coordination with public transportation service providers and potential providers. Failure to use funds in a significant way for service expansions or improvements. So if you're coming forward with a proposal that would largely maintain existing services, that's probably not at all a good idea either. Failure to propose to use funds consistent, at some level of consistency with the 7 areas of emphasis or criteria, particularly the serving low-income households. Reporting and accountability. So STIF plans must include quantifiable estimated service outcomes. QEs will submit quarterly progress reports on expenditures and actual outcomes. And for certain project types, there are required measures. And in particular, it's for operations projects. So things like, and it's data that you are probably already collecting for the most part, reporting to NTD, with a few things that are slightly different because of the low-income population emphasis. So that's things like number of rides or miles of service for operations projects. And then we have, there's optional performance measures. If you have a project, and this is, again, wanting to provide flexibility, if you are tracking and you are measuring your progress in different ways, and that's data that you want to report to us, absolutely put that in there. There's also, not everything is quantifiable. So in some cases, it is a matter of describing the benefits that will occur as a result of your project. Okay, and I've already covered the fourth bullet. So here are the reporting requirements that are specific to the formula fund rules, so in addition to the general requirements. So we've covered quarterly progress reports on expenditures and outcomes. We will reconcile disbursements against the expenditures, and again, that's the end of the biennium, and then the excess funds would be carried forward by the QE. Okay, so this is the last piece on formula funds. Any questions about formula before we move into discretionary?
From Region 1, is Buy America required for capital procurement?
At the risk of being wrong, because I know just enough to be dangerous, my recollection is that Buy America is a federal requirement, and these are state funds, so no, it would not pertain. Unless you are leveraging STIF funds with federal funds, so $1 of federal funds would then make it a requirement. Okay, so discretionary STIF funds. We're moving into Division 44, which there's the table of contents. So I guess this is our big new information for today, which is we just, as of the PTAC meeting on Monday, settled on our discretionary solicitation schedule. Frank is typing madly. Quick, Frank, more Red Bull.
Given that providers are already providing STIF classified rides, I think that's part of the question.
I don't know what an STIF classified ride is. Oh, Frank. Okay, I'm going to keep going on discretionary solicitation. We'll come back when we get that full question. We're anticipating issuing the notice in October with having applications due in February. One of the things that's a little bit different about this process is that the QE advisory committees are required to make recommendations on discretionary funding. The rules, and I'll get to that in a minute, and there's also an opportunity for the area commissions on transportation to comment on the projects as part of the statewide review. We have a selection committee review process that will occur, and then that proposed award from the selection committee goes to PTAC for their review. ODOT now has a two-touch requirement for OTC decision making. We first do a presentation of the information, and then we come back the next month and OTC makes their award decision. And then we have a brief gap there where grant agreements would be written, and then it would go into effect October 1, 2019. And then the agreement period would be through the end of the biennium, June 2021. In future biennia, our plan would be to align these solicitations with our other solicitations. Okay, so
I think
back to Frank's question.
given that providers are already providing rides to low-income passengers, how will future rides be differentiated?
In terms of reporting, I feel like that is a sort of a detailed and nuanced question that each provider is going to have to take a look at for themselves in terms of what, if there needs to be, for example, an allocation method, so you're using, say, multiple fund sources to fund a transit route, for example. So what is that percentage that is STIF funding, and what is your passenger count, and et cetera? And I think that's one of the things that RTCs can help providers with figuring out that method if folks need assistance with that. And I think that's going to be tricky in some areas. Okay, so the discretionary and intercommunity discretionary fund rules, the key elements of them. So this section, we put both discretionary and intercommunity discretionary together because they have a lot of things in common, and the areas where they are different, they are specified. So we'll talk about eligibility, what providers and projects are eligible, match rate, investment priorities, and project selection. And we'll come back to Region 4's question in a bit. So all public transportation service providers may apply directly to ODOT for discretionary funds. Both are on a statewide competitive basis. For the discretionary fund, now you recall that transit is no longer eligible for funding in Connect Oregon. This discretionary fund, STIF money, is seen somewhat as a replacement for those Connect Oregon funds. All project types are eligible except for ongoing operations in the discretionary fund. So that means you could propose a project that is a pilot operations project, for example. We'll get into that in a bit more detail in a minute. For intercommunity discretionary funds, all types of projects are eligible, including ongoing operations projects. And again, we'll talk about that. Actually, I'll go ahead and talk about it now. Under the intercommunity fund, we're really overtly cautioning providers that because of its discretionary competitive nature, you're not guaranteed ongoing operation funds. And this is, I think, somewhat of a funding source of last resort, if you will, for operations funding. And so that caution exists. Match rate, overall match rate of 20%. You can use STIF formula funds to meet the match rate, and there are some exceptions. There will be a 10% match accepted for projects that serve rural communities, and that's defined as communities with populations that are less than 50,000 people. For projects that fill a gap in the statewide transit network. And there'll be more content, I think, coming from us about what is a statewide transit network, what are the kinds of projects that are gap projects. If the project serves an area outside of a transit boundary, and if the project provides a statewide benefit. So if you're testing a new technology or you're doing some pilot something that if it's successful and effective, it could benefit providers across the state. That would also garner a lower match rate. And our intent here is to incentivize with a lower match rate areas that might be tougher to serve otherwise. Investment priorities. So the rules have investment priorities that are improving service to low-income households, improving coordination between providers and reducing gaps in service, the consistency with the OPTP, and investing in projects that have sustainable operations funding plans that don't rely on state discretionary funding. So again, this points to this source of funding is really trying to discourage relying on discretionary funding for ongoing operations. The Commission, with input from PTAC, might also direct us to consider other factors. In the first solicitation, we're proposing to use the base criteria established in rules, but in the future, the criteria could evolve to further hone investment priorities. So, for example, we might see that the fleet condition is worsening and we're at risk of going below our goal. We could, for that solicitation, decide that we're going to invest, all of the money on replacement vehicles, for example. So that's one example of how that could evolve. So in addition to these investment criteria, the other piece that I should mention is that all things held equal, geographic equity and the ability to leverage other funds can also be a deciding factor in which projects to award. And then let's go ahead and take that question. That's a good one.
With the discretionary program, will the application become the agreement?
No, it will not. The discretionary will require separate agreements. The STIF formula fund plan becoming the agreement is really unique to all of our programs, and that is an outcome of the law.
Jennifer says, point system can hinder intercommunity service like Greyhound. Will ODOT be looking at ways to allow greater flexibility?
I do not understand that question. Can you state it in a different way?
Do you want to go back to Region 4's question about Optus?
Sure.
Can we expect low-income ridership reporting in Optus?
I'm trying to remember. I think the answer is yes, but you have to wait and look at guidance around, look at the template and look at guidance. And I think there's a difference between the low-income ridership, and it might be more along the lines, and don't quote me on this, I think it is more targeted to access to public transportation for communities with a high percentage of low-income households. But again, I don't want to steer you wrong on that, so that's a look at the template and look at guidance response.
That's all we have right now.
So the project selection process. So public transportation service providers would submit your applications to ODOT. We will provide your applications to the QE's advisory committees for their consideration. They can make a recommendation of fund or do not fund the project, and they have the option of prioritizing the projects that are within their QE's area of responsibility. So if we get into a situation where we're looking at geographic equity and we want to fund, 2 projects in, Southwest Oregon, that's where we would look at, is there a prioritization that happened in relying on the region's prioritization of projects, for example, as one factor in a larger list of considerations. We'll also provide applications to the regions for the area commissions on transportation to review and provide comment. They can provide comment. We're not asking them for recommendations on whether to fund or not fund. And we'll likely have some sort of template or questions in terms of structuring comments. And then all of that information will be considered by a recommendation committee, and then PTAC recommends funding awards.
Jennifer clarified her question. Southwest Point has non-compete clauses with Greyhound hindering service times in areas we want them open.
That's a very specific question, and I think one that we'll deal with offline. Okay, so on your last, on this near the end slide, and this PowerPoint will be posted online with the hyperlinks active. This is basically, I think, a list of most of the documents that you have in your packets and some of the things that you can rely on for additional help. We have a PDF of the STIF rules on the right navigation bar. Secretary of State has updated the OARs, so you could find the OARs on their site now, so we'll provide a link to that as well. We did this STIF rules overview fact sheet with the new schedule that you have in your packets. There's also a flow chart that illustrates the plan process. Same thing with the QE map. The formula fund allocation estimate is in our document library, as is the formula fund sub-allocation guidance with hyperlinks to employment department resources. And then our responses to the FAQs. It's currently a very dated document, and we'll be updating it within the next couple of weeks to reflect the questions that we've received during this webinar, as well as the questions that are generated in the workshops this afternoon.
From Region 2, do service providers have to go to an advisory committee before submitting to ODOT? I think meaning discretionary.
Yeah, the answer is no. The process is that they come to us first, and then we distribute them to the relevant advisory committees. So, for example, on an intercommunity project, you might actually be touching multiple qualified entity areas of responsibility. So that project would actually be reviewed by multiple advisory committees, and then that data compiled by us. We thought that would be a more straightforward process than the PTSP trying to figure out and get the right contacts for each of the QEs and get that out in a timely fashion. So that's a responsibility we decided to take on for that reason. Now there could be some projects that have a statewide significance, but the project originates in a particular QE's area. If it's a project of statewide significance, we probably would not send that to the QE for advisory committee recommendation because of its statewide significance. So next steps. The formula fund solicitation notice will be issued no later than August 1st. That notice is going to include a hyperlink to the online STIF plan template for qualified entities, a document that has formula fund guidance and application instructions, and a hyperlink to the STIF project applications that QEs may ask PTSPs to use to submit project applications for advisory committee review. We'll be holding a webinar likely in mid-August. It has not been scheduled yet, but will be scheduled soon, on how to complete the STIF plan template. Similar to this webinar, we'll record that webinar as well. August, as we know, is full-on vacation season. I personally would like to take the whole month off, but that's not really possible. So we will be recording it, though, to help make sure that it's available later if you missed the webinar. And the RTCs will be fully up to speed on the template and will be available to help you complete it as well. And then we are also considering additional webinars on key topics such as determining the high percentage of low-income households and other potential topics depending on need. And so make your training requests through your RTC. We're continually evaluating what the needs are and are prepared to do additional trainings as necessary. But I think the determining high percentage low-income households one will definitely occur. So questions should be about STIF should first be directed to your regional transit coordinator. We are all in very close coordination, and if there's a question that you ask them and they can't answer, they'll coordinate with me and our leadership to get your questions answered. And I think the other thing I want to say is that I know this is a lot, folks. This is a new program, and we are all learning and building as we grow, and we are really excited about the opportunity to be able to improve transit service across the state, and we want to do our best to really help everybody be successful. So I think with that, that is my last slide. Oh my gosh, 10:54. That's amazing. Are there any final questions before I sign off and you all